1 year later, there are hopeful signs COVID may finally be coming under control. Still, it's been a long and heartbreaking road, as Martha Teichner reports.
Think back over the year of COVID and tell me what images are really striking in your mind.
Empty cities.
Broadway, just empty.
Store after store closing and then shutting down.
People apart day after day after day.
We asked 6 prominent public figures to remember and reflect.
Masks. So that would be number 1. Number 2 would be the Zoom checker box.
Americans in hunger lines, in food lines.
The snapshot in my head is of lines, those food lines, and the lines to sign up for unemployment, the lines to be tested for coronavirus, then to vote, and now, a year into the pandemic, to be vaccinated. What has the year of COVID done to us as a nation psychologically?
The honest answer is that we really don't know, because humans are so complex and we have so many ways of adapting.
Steven Pinker is a psychology professor at Harvard. People can't touch. They can't hug each other. They can't shake hands. What's been the impact of that?
My grandparents would stay in touch with their relatives through the mails. Now, nothing can substitute for a hug, a kiss, being in each other's presence, but we can go a large part of the way through language.
Thank heaven for Zoom and all its cousins. This has been the year of living, loving, working through glass. But dying that way, alone, is part of the tragedy of COVID. Saying goodbye to a loved one on a cell phone held up by a nurse. Agonizing.
For the people who have lost friends, relatives, intimates, there also has to be a kind of a delayed period of mourning because we've not had funerals. And in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic, that would certainly lead to a somber recognition of what we've been through.
A stock-taking. More than 500,000 Americans dead and counting. And how do we even try to count the cost, especially to minority and at-risk kids, of a year in which most couldn't go to in-person school?
You're consigning people to more and more inequality and more suffering in the country.
University of Pennsylvania professor Mary Frances Berry chaired the U.S. Civil Rights Commission.
That education story is the saddest of the stories that coming out of this, aside from the people who have died.
Here's a pretty shocking statistic. Life expectancy for all Americans fell by a full year in the first half of 2020. But for Hispanics, nearly 2 years. And for Black Americans, nearly 3 years.
Black folks seem to get, as part of our history, more of everything that's bad and less of everything that's good. That's just part of our history. We know that there are these disparities, and with the pandemic, it's just worse.
In April, when COVID job losses were at their worst, more than 22 million people were unemployed. More than half of those jobs have come back, but significant racial differences persist.
So going into COVID, I already was convinced that we were going to see more and more digitization of work, more and more automation of work, more and more, therefore, erosion of jobs that you would call middle skill, middle income jobs.
University of California, Berkeley professor Laura Tyson headed the Council of Economic Advisors during the Clinton administration.
We were going to see an opportunity for more high-skill jobs, and we were going to see this barbell. We were going to see an increase in low-skill jobs. So the barbell is the middle kind of disappears. And everything I have heard from the surveys or seen from the evidence is that COVID is just accelerating all of that.
Think of our COVID-hollowed cities. Office towers emptied out when their occupants were told to go home and work. So many of the mom-and-pop shops nearby, the restaurants, shut for good because their customers were gone.
I think remote work is the biggie.
But urban studies theorist Richard Florida thinks cities will bounce back quickly, at least some of them.
New York for sure does well. Washington, Boston, San Francisco, Seattle, they all end up okay. Does Chicago come back the way it was? What about Detroit? What about Cincinnati or Cleveland or Buffalo? Those are places that would keep me up at night more. I think the COVID has tipped the scales a little bit more towards the Sun Belt.
During our year in lockdown, we found ways to thank the heroes who risked their lives for us, who chose to help others. But often those heroes were casualties of the pandemic themselves.
Before the pandemic, in my company, we had 1,100 people working, almost 1,200. Right now, we are around 450.
Not even noted chef and restaurateur José Andrés could escape the catastrophe COVID brought to the more than 13 million people employed in the U.S. restaurant industry. Nearly 1 out of 5 restaurants has closed permanently in the last year.
It's been hard. At times, I had more than one tear.
But through World Central Kitchen, the not-for-profit he founded in 2010 to feed people in time of crisis around the globe, Andrés set out at least to staunch the hemorrhage and do some good here.
If you have the restaurants of America close, what better than have the restaurants of America feeding the people in need, and in the process keep the economy going, nobody getting rich, but at least making sure that the restaurants were safe, but actively feeding, making some money, paying the employees, paying rent, keeping the business afloat, and in the process covering the needs of the hungry.
During COVID, World Central Kitchen has served nearly 40 million meals in more than 400 U.S. cities so far.
Thank you, Mom. You too.
A toast to the groom.
Renée Elise Goldsberry won a Tony for her role in Hamilton. She was on a concert tour when just about the entire arts, entertainment, and recreation industry suddenly shut down. In New York City alone, 2/3 of the jobs in the field, nearly 60,000, went away.
The impact of COVID on my industry is just devastating. It's kind of a loss of the thing that makes our life worth living. It is a loss of, it's kind of like being taken away from our church in a way. We figured it out though.
525,600 minutes.
Zoom to the rescue. Broadway stars like Goldsberry decided the show must go on and raised money for fellow artists.
We came in like the cavalry. We recognized that not only did we desperately need to find a way to come together and do what we do as artists, the world needed us to show up and do that, and we did.
Last Wednesday, the city of New York announced that beginning in April, theaters can start reopening with small pop-up performances. Packed Broadway shows, still a mirage on the horizon.
We will limp back in, kind of battered and bruised, but we are determined to come back.
Will we all just limp back into the world when finally the threat of COVID recedes? Or will we all bust out of lockdown, as New Zealanders are starting to do? Will the 2020s be another roaring 20s? Has there tended to be a party after the plague?
After some historic pandemics, there have been bursts of celebration. After the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918-1919, there were the Roaring Twenties. There were reports after the horrific Black Death of the 14th century that there was a burst of debauchery and celebration and partying in the years afterwards.
I'm not looking forward to a second roaring Trinity. What I'm looking forward to is being able to finally see friends and relatives and go out and have dinner and have a good bottle of wine, good conversations, face to face.